Okay, hello. My name is Oleksii Danyliuk. I'm a software engineer in Go4. Right now I'm working in GovStack project, and it's huge, complicated project which require writing documentation. But right now I would focus on not open source project, but on proprietary projects. I would describe that some common problems, for instance, important information spread among many places. Usually it can be in Confluence, in email, Slack, maybe Google Docs, and it's difficult to get understanding what is the current state, what is updated, what is not updated. Another common issue, I would say, is that sometimes, not always, we have good Jira tickets, epics, and sometimes it's lacking of clarity and details. So I would try to describe, if it resonates with you, I would try to describe my vision, how we can deal with that, and maybe we can slightly change point of view on those situations. So I would focus on like rules or suggestion, what to do to improve the situation. One of the strong suggestions, I would even say it, rule, keep documentations as close as possible to implementation. So basically we have our project in Git, under system control of version, and let's create a separate folder in a root. Let's call it docs, and we can use Markdown language. There is a few options. It can be as MD or Markdown, like common format. Or I would suggest to use maybe even more sophisticated Markdown language, which is ASCII doc, or short version ADOC. And let's describe complexity in those files in this folder. And let's do it like step by step, gradually. And when someone updates some implementation, it's always good to take a look on documentation on this part which related to changes of implementation, and update documentation at the same time. In this situation, we will always have updated documentation, and documentation would be a source of truth. I have an example, and today we did something, and I just, as an example, I would try to share with you how it's supposed to looks like. The value, the like implementations, it's not important, but what I'm trying to show you, for instance, it's update of pipeline configuration and some Kubernetes changes. We can see here like YAML, we are talking about implementation, and the last file, it's related file to documentation. So those changes describe what we did, and in this case it's very convenient to compare implementation with documentations, and for everyone it's easier to make a better quality code review and provide better feedback. Another important aspect of that, from historical perspective, from retrospective perspective, when we did something, when we found some issue, and by the time we think, yeah, it was not optimal decision, who did it? Maybe someone can start to blame someone, but you know, it's so easy to lose context why we did some decision. There is sophisticated approach for those situations. we can write architect decision records. But maybe it's too complicated, it's not so common, but I would say even if we follow this approach when we would update documentation with implementation, it's like piece of important information which provide context, why we did it, and in this case we are not losing important information and we have better understanding on project. Any questions, any suggestions, objections? Please welcome. So, yeah.
Question. Like, why not put this, like the example that you showed, that just looked like a commit message?
Yes, exactly.
So why not just put it in the commit message itself, not as a separate file?
Yes, awesome question. Why not? Because we have a huge limitation in commit message. We don't have this nice, we cannot break down complexity in one commit message, but in Markdown you have, you can import, so it's, I would say, the most sophisticated tool to describe complexity. You can use pictures, video, you can use whatever kind of information. You are not limited by text, you can write title, and so you cannot do it in commit message. And so commit message is something like atomicity, it's related to this particular commit message. But documentation has structure, and structure very helpful to navigate. And you usually update small piece of documentation, but this piece can be in different places.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, mostly it's about breaking down complexity. And I would say writing documentation can help a lot for proper even architecture. Maybe it sounds too bold, but anyway, you are trying to describe complexity in pure like English language, and you and you cannot usually do it in one file. It takes like some structure, folders, navigations. We can see the same situations in any mainstream documentation regards Kubernetes. This is one what I remember. Nice navigations about whole, like usually in the left corner there is like whole navigations about whole project. In the right corner there is navigation about particular file. And those structure just helpful to not lost in project. And when we are trying to describe project in the same way, it's easy to get better understanding. And it's additional moment to think about where we should put this logic, what belong to someone, and those additional situations when we're supposed to think about architecture usually helps to have better architecture. Another important point, let's write only what is right now, our current understand about projects. Sometimes I would like to write something about future to not forget about, but I would not suggest to do it, because in this case documentation cannot be a single source of truth, and it's losing this importance. And instead it would be better to keep those things somewhere else. The best case would be a separate like feature branch where you can describe how feature is supposed to behave, and you can keep this separate branch separately, start to implement it, and again, when something is ready, when you are interested or ready to push into main branch, just pick a dedicated or related part of documentations in the same commit message or in the same commit, in the same PR, and merge into main branch. And I would like to share with you one story, how it starts. So I'm using this approach roughly for 2 years, and it starts in one proprietary project, and I was lucky to work with one product owner who was agreed to try it, and we agreed that product owner, instead of writing Jira tickets or Epic, he write documentation about feature in separate branch, and he opened a pull request, and we started to review his pull request from technical perspective. Is it enough information for us? And we challenge it, and we ask specific questions regarding how to implement it. And he provided enough information, and after that we agreed how it's supposed to behave, and we started to implement, and when it was ready, we pull his documentation to our implementation and merge into main branch together. Yeah, regards not clear Jira tickets, why it happens. So from practical point, I would say not always clear what exactly it's not clear for someone else. When you encounter a bug or issue, you are just trying to briefly describe it, do not waste of time, and it seems like it's fine for me, and I would say I assume that it's supposed to fine for someone else, but usually it's not the case. Like always, it's not the case. It's nice to try to provide more context, but how much context I supposed to provide? And it takes some practice, some experience, and maybe it sounds like a useless job, like why I should do it right now. But in case of documentation, you already have a structure, you already have a context, and you are just trying to change what you change in your implementation. And those structure framework helps you to get scope, what exactly you need to change. And it seems like it supports you. So, yeah. Something what is very common nowadays, use ChatGPT. If someone afraid to write technical text, I guess it's fine to use it, but we should use it wisely, because from my experience it can be too soft or too optimistic or too verbose, and I would say that documentation is supposed to be intuitive, short, like brief, without all those fancy words. So please use ChatGPT wisely. And blocks, misunderstanding, misconceptions, what I saw from my practice of using this approach. I have understanding the biggest issue why people mostly afraid or not interested in this approach, and I would say this approach not so common at all. And I think like Git as a system control version, you have to have some knowledge about branches, about commit, and those things blocking many people, especially non-technical people. So this is something important, and need to support people, non-technical people, in these situations, and be friendly, kind, and if you're interested. So this is some cost of those approach. I would say that even for technical people, it's not common and not obvious. And I would say seems like it's just requires some change of point of view, that you should be open to try it, at least to try it. Another sentence what I heard that yeah, it sounds good, it's yeah, I would like to try it, but you know my project it's legacy already, and it's I guess it wouldn't work. But I started it not from legacy, but I started somewhere in the middle, and it doesn't matter when you're supposed to start. It's just something useful for me, and I'm happy to start at any point when I'm interested to learn, discover some complex situation. Some benefits. Yeah, so in this case we will have a pure like English human language text, no YAML, Java classes or whatever. It would be just English pure language with pictures, diagrams, maybe video, whatever. And in this case, it's so convenient to share with anyone in your company. There is no technical limitations. It's everybody supposed to understand. And in this case, we will have a single like page. Everybody would be on the same page in company. It's very convenient for syncing and having common understanding. Again, I said a little bit about architecture. We can challenge this point. And some small sweetie things that you can be more efficient. You don't need to always describe the same thing in messages, in emails. You can just create a branch and specifically describe what you would like to change. And so, because everything else already with in Git repository. Yeah, and I would say I would compare slightly with Confluence, those approach. Sometimes it's my like even my I personally have some issue with that when I'm working with Confluence and I'm trying to describe it. It's difficult to ask feedbacks from someone else about your changes. Usually in Confluence you can change something and save it, and that's it. Like there is no this phase of asking for review. And for those who are not so sure is it correct or not, it can be a block, and people would not participate, people would not practice, people would not grow. But with Git, they can start from a small step, and they can start with small things, and they can grow those skills and be better in this approach. So this is a link to source of this presentation.
Is it Git repo?
It's a Git snippet.
But actually, I was thinking, I have a couple questions or like continuation to the discussion. So first one is that you're talking about still free-form English text. How do you, or how would you keep the free-form text in sync with actual code changes? So in this context, I understand that you have like the design doc for a system, which is inside the same Git repo where the actual code will be added later, right? No?
No. It means, for example, you write some feature, and you are just writing how feature behaves in separate file, markdown, just describing like language, simple language. You can copy pasta from Epic or from Jira ticket. Someone supposed to already describe how feature supposed to behave, and you just take it. You just find a proper place in documentation and merge.
But I'm talking about like, you're talking about the free-form English text inside a Git repo where you actually have, for example, I don't know, Java code.
Yes, yes.
So that would be in the same Git repo, right? And my question is that how would you make sure that people actually keep those in sync as well? Let's say there's a code change, and
Okay.
how do you make sure that the people actually reflect those changes in the textual documentation?
Okay, good question.
You can repeat the question because
Yeah, how to be sure that always when you change implementations, someone change documentation accordingly. So I don't know. It's only how you treat your documentation project. If you're interested, there is no tool which would detect or which will.
That was sort of a directed question because I actually I have a vague memory of a linter that is able to that you can set up references in the files that if you change a section, you must change something else as well. So you could actually probably set up some sort of a linter mechanism that forces you to make sure that both sections are changed at the same time.
It's possible, but from my experience with linter, with another quality code filter, it can be very not productive. And it's still experiment, I would say, and I would encourage to be just supportive and try to do it, but to force it and to block it and just make some validation tool, I didn't see that someone is like, I don't have this experience and I'm not sure if it's a proper way to do it.
So this works well only when you have like a big monorepo for all the codes, but what do you do when you have several small components to just split out the documentation to different repos, and then you have some separate build step that collects everything together, or like how do you then build this coherent view of all the components and the architecture?
So thank you for questions. The question is, does it work only for monorepo, or how to manage multi-service or multi-repo project with different maybe versions? And in this case, there is a framework which called Antora, and it's exactly for these situations. You can pull documentation from different repositories, and Antora will take everything and create one page which will include all versions and all documentation from different repositories. And yes, and this is important to keep documentations close to implementation. Yeah, and Antora very helpful when you need to pull from different places.
Didn't know that. That looks really sexy.
Yeah, I would say efficient, productive. It helps a lot.
You talked about adding charts and diagrams into the documentation, but Markdown native doesn't support that. Do you use something external to build those images into it, or generate them somehow? The plant UML or something similar to the diagrams?
So the question is what to use for diagrams. I'm using usually Draw.io, and Draw.io provides can export a PNG file, and this file has enough metadata. And if you're using, for instance, IntelliJ IDE, you can upload plugin, and in this case, it looks like a picture, but in IntelliJ IDEA you can change it as a diagram and save a new version of diagram. And again, I was so surprised that we can do it, like change a picture. And when you change, you again can save a new version of this picture, and you can track version of diagrams as well. Another case or system, it's Mermaid, open source as well product, which allows you create like UML diagrams, and you can save text, and based on those texts you can use plugins, and those plugins would locally generate for you those diagrams. But from practical experience, I would suggest to use Java.io to export picture, and pull request, merge request will include those pictures, and during the review you can just observe diagram and understand what is going on instead of rendering picture in your mind from sources. Yeah, so doesn't matter small project, huge project, just to keep complexity somewhere written, and that you can trust for those documentations. You can change, you can have full control on that. It's helpful, and yeah, I guess this boring topic is end.
But what about the, I'm not sure if it's related to this, but like when I originally read like code as documentation, I also thought about this, what is this Swagger, and what are the tools that automatically generate documentation from source code? What about this, and how, what is like, what is the relationship between Swagger and this, and how much do they overlap?
So there is automatical tools to generate documentations, for example, for API like a Swagger, and how they relate to with documentation in Markdown. I would say that those tools for specific niche, and API descriptions in something in the middle between pure human language and just implementation. And so this is some nice way to describe API between technical people. And something that I would like to mention in documentation, especially in with ad hoc Markdown language, you can export, and from source code particular case. In project we define types in a class which called like enumeration. We define specific class which is super critical, and we export from like Java class to documentation, and we have one place where we change those types. And again, this is helpful that it builds trust to this documentation. The same you can do with Swagger. You can export something, some particular API, description of API in one particular place in documentation. So it's kind of a layer on top of layer. And if you need to describe particular API using Swagger in documentation, you can easily import it, and you can make some collapse. If someone interested to know more details, he can press collapse and show particular details of this API. For someone, maybe it's enough just to have simple English language definition, description. They are not contradict, and in Swagger you cannot like easily describe how feature is supposed to behave.
Do I understand correctly that you can use some special Markdown code and export exactly these cases?
Yes, Antora,
Annotations or something.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a tool that there is a way that you can define which part of like Java class you would export into documentation.
Mm.
So Antora would be sort of this umbrella thing that brings everything together.
Yes, yes, yes. It will pull from repositories and it will generate HTML files, and those files would be exported to some engines place.
Static site.
Static site, yeah, exactly. So, and I guess it started to be not WordPress, and it started to be more common when those static site generator started to be more common. And right now with GitHub pages, GitLab pages, it's cost nothing to serve those things, and now it's become more and more common and convenient. Another case, if we are talking about proprietary software, so you cannot like publish in GitHub pages or GitLab pages publicly. And what I did, I was using Nginx, and I made an API filter, and we were using VPN in our company, so it was a solution. But there is many ways how to do it, but you need to do something by your hand. On the other hand, we can use Gitbook. It's some product from GitHub, which basically is providing those functionality, but you have to pay for that. And it provides some additional features, so you can have closed communication, comments regarding documentation. Okay, thank you for your time. Okay, any questions, please write.
No questions.
No questions.
Okay, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, bye.